It was an ordinary Thursday morning at the Maple Leaf Diner, a cozy, family-owned establishment nestled on Main Street in a quiet town. The scent of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee filled the air as the sound of clinking plates and the murmur of conversations blended into the familiar hum of the morning rush. Jasmine stood behind the counter, expertly balancing her duties. As a black waitress at the diner for over 3 years, she knew the ins and outs of every regular customer, every order, and every look that passed between people. She had a knack for reading the room, something that made her the go-to person for handling tricky situations. Most of her customers were regulars who came in for the same eggs, bacon, and pancakes every morning. Some would tell jokes, others would gossip about the latest town drama, and a few kept to themselves, sipping their coffee in silence. It was a small town, but it was lively, and the Maple Leaf had become a staple for many who called the town home. That morning, like any other, Jasmine smiled as she approached a table near the back. The regulars were already there: Bill, a retired schoolteacher, Mrs. Taylor, an elderly woman who loved to gossip, and Jake, a farmer who had a tendency to make everything sound like a crisis. But today, something felt different. Jasmine couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was an energy in the air, a sense that something big was about to happen. She served them their usuals, made small talk about the weather, and refilled coffee cups as she had done 1,000 times before. Everything seemed routine. That was, until the door opened with a chime, and a figure entered that immediately caught everyone's attention. Barron Trump, son of the former President of the United States, walked through the door. Jasmine froze for a split second. Her first thought was, what is he doing here? He was tall, dressed casually in a jacket and jeans, looking almost like any other young man stepping into a small-town diner. But there was an unmistakable air of recognition that passed through the room as people started whispering. Some looked in surprise, while others clearly tried to act nonchalant, as though they were perfectly accustomed to such high-profile guests. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly composed herself. She couldn't afford to let the nerves show, not now. This was her job, and she had always prided herself on being professional, no matter the situation. The Maple Leaf Diner had seen its fair share of tourists and out-of-town visitors, but this was different. This was Barron Trump. The room seemed to hold its breath as he approached the counter and sat down in a booth, looking around like he was simply looking for a quiet meal away from the world. Jasmine moved toward him with a quick glance at her fellow staff, who were also staring with wide eyes. She had a job to do, and that meant serving him just like any other customer. "Good morning," Jasmine said, offering a smile. "What can I get for you?" Barron looked up at her, offering a small, friendly smile in return. "I'll have the pancakes, please," he said in a soft voice, the kind that made it hard to tell if he was just another young man or someone who had lived his entire life under a microscope. She wrote down his order, her hand slightly shaking. She didn't know why she was nervous. She had waited on politicians, businessmen, and celebrities in the past, but something about this moment felt different. It wasn't just Barron's presence, it was the weight of the situation. There was an unspoken tension in the room. People were staring, whispering, trying to figure out why he was here, what he was doing in this small town, and what it meant. Jasmine turned away to prepare the meal, but the tension didn't dissipate. She could hear the murmurs of conversation behind her. What's he doing here? Is he really just sitting down to eat? Does he know who's serving him? The words, though hushed, made her feel more like an outsider in her own workplace. When she returned with Barron's pancakes, she couldn't help but notice how everyone's eyes followed her every move. She placed the plate in front of him, giving him a polite nod before turning to go back to her station. As she did, however, she heard voices rising in the background, loud, angry voices. There was a dispute at another table, and the mood in the diner shifted from quiet curiosity to open hostility. Two men at a corner table were arguing loudly, their voices carrying over the soft clinking of silverware. Jasmine's instincts kicked in. It was always her role to defuse these situations. She turned around, taking in the scene. One of the men was clearly trying to make a political point, loudly criticizing Baron's family and bringing up issues that had no place in a public setting. The other man, apparently in agreement with him, started to get angrier. Jasmine couldn't let it go on. There was only so much she could ignore, and this was one of those moments that demanded action. Without thinking too much, she moved toward the table, stepping in between the two men, her voice calm but firm. "Gentlemen, this is a public place. Let's keep the conversation respectful," she said, hoping to ease the tension before things escalated. She didn't want anyone to feel uncomfortable, especially not Baron. He was just trying to eat his meal quietly, and the last thing anyone needed was for the situation to spiral out of control. But as she spoke, one of the men, who was clearly more irate, stood up abruptly. "You're defending him," he sneered, his face red with anger. "You don't even know who he is, do you?" His voice was rising, and Jasmine could see his body language getting more aggressive. The diner had fallen silent, all eyes now on her and the escalating confrontation. Jasmine, who had always been quick on her feet, tried to remain calm. She took a step back, trying to defuse the situation without making it worse. "Sir, I'm just doing my job. I'm not here to argue politics," she said, her voice firm but not confrontational. "Please sit down and enjoy your meal. We can all be adults here." But the man wasn't listening. He was too far gone, his anger clouding any rational thought. He turned to Baron, pointing an accusing finger at him. "You've got no place in this town, you don't belong here," he yelled. "You and your family have ruined everything for everyone." Jasmine's stomach churned. She wasn't sure if the man was referring to Baron's father, the former president, or to Baron himself, but it didn't matter. It was clear that this was more than just a heated argument, it was about something much larger. The diner, the town, and everyone in it were being pulled into a larger political storm. Before anyone could react, Jasmine made a decision. She couldn't stand by while a young man, no matter who he was being verbally attacked. She stepped forward, placing a hand on the angry man's arm, her voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's enough. We don't tolerate this kind of behavior here." The man yanked his arm away, shocked by the confrontation. "Who do you think you are?" he shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "You can't tell me what to do." Jasmine took a deep breath. "I'm telling you to leave," she said. "This isn't the place for it. Either you calm down or I'll have to ask you to leave." The room was tense. The regulars were silent, watching with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. The man stood frozen for a moment, staring at her, before he threw his napkin down in frustration. "You're siding with him, aren't you?" he spat, before turning toward the door. "I'll never come back here again." With the altercation finally over, Jasmine turned back toward Baron, her heart still racing from the adrenaline of the confrontation. She hadn't planned for any of this, but she knew she had done the right thing. Baron looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He seemed genuinely surprised by her intervention. "Thank you," he said softly. "I didn't expect that." Jasmine simply nodded, her hands still trembling slightly. "No problem. Just trying to keep things peaceful." But as she turned to walk away, she heard a voice from behind her. It was Mr. Thompson, the owner of the diner, and his voice was anything but friendly. "Jasmine, we need to talk," he said, his tone cold and stern. Her stomach dropped. She knew what was coming. The weight of Mr. Thompson's words hung in the air, thick with tension. Jasmine stood frozen for a moment, her breath catching in her throat as she turned to face her boss. She had worked at the Maple Leaf Diner for over 3 years, pouring her heart into her job, making regulars feel at home and making sure everything ran smoothly. She knew Mr. Thompson well. He was the kind of person who kept his emotions close to his chest, his opinions shaped by his conservative beliefs. There had always been an unspoken understanding between them. She did her job, and he kept things running his way. But today, something was different. As she walked toward the back office, her mind raced. What had she done wrong? She had just tried to defuse a potentially dangerous situation, to protect someone who wasn't even a regular customer, and now she was about to face her boss's wrath. Was it because she had gotten involved in politics? She hadn't even known who Baron Trump was when he walked in. He was just another young man looking for breakfast. But the way things had played out, it felt as though she had crossed an invisible line. Jasmine stepped into the small office at the back of the diner, her stomach tied in knots. The room was dim, filled with the stale scent of old coffee and the faint smell of grease from the kitchen. Mr. Thompson sat behind his desk, his thick eyebrows furrowed as he looked up at her, his face unreadable. She could tell that he was trying to maintain control, but there was an edge to his voice when he spoke. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Jasmine obeyed, her hands folded in her lap as she tried to steady herself. She had no idea what was coming, but the silence between them was palpable. She could hear the distant clinking of silverware from the dining area, the sound of a normal day continuing without her. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Thompson spoke, his voice low and stern. "Jasmine, I've known you long enough to know that you're a good worker. You've always been reliable, you've always done your job, but what you did today," he stopped himself, running a hand through his hair as if trying to gather his thoughts. "You crossed a line." Jasmine's heart sank. "I was just trying to help, Mr. Thompson. That man was escalating things, and I couldn't just stand there and let it happen. He was getting personal, Anne." "You stepped into something that was none of your business," he interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "That's a political matter, Jasmine. You don't get involved in that stuff here. This is a family restaurant. We don't mix business with politics, and you know that." Jasmine's chest tightened. She had known the rules: no talk of politics, no bringing personal beliefs into the workplace. But she hadn't thought of it as a political issue. It had been about respect, about de-escalating a dangerous situation before it got out of hand. She had acted on instinct, not ideology. "I didn't mean to make things political," Jasmine said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I just saw a situation where someone was being attacked, and I couldn't let it go on. It wasn't about who Baron Trump is. It was about doing what was right." Mr. Thompson's gaze hardened, and he leaned forward slightly. "You're missing the point. You made a scene, Jasmine. You put yourself in a position where now I'm getting calls from people who are angry. Angry that you took his side, angry that you involved yourself in something that should have stayed out of the public eye. You've caused trouble for this restaurant, and that's not something I can just overlook." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had only been trying to do the right thing, and now she was the one being blamed for the fallout. It didn't seem fair, but she knew that fairness wasn't always a factor when it came to business. Mr. Thompson had to protect the diner's reputation, and he had customers to answer to. In a small town like this, where politics often bled into personal lives, one wrong move could cost you everything. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson," Jasmine said softly, the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. "I didn't think about how it would look. I just—" "You didn't think, Jasmine. That's the problem," he snapped. "You acted without considering the consequences. You've embarrassed me in front of my customers, and you've made things harder for this business. I don't know what you were thinking, but I have to let you go." The words echoed in her mind, almost like they were coming from somewhere far away. Let her go. She had been fired. Just like that. She wasn't sure how to respond. It was as if her body had stopped moving, frozen in place as the reality of what was happening sank in. She had just lost her job, her only source of income, all because she had stood up for someone who needed help. Mr. Thompson, please, she began, but he raised a hand to stop her. Jasmine, it's not up for debate, he said, his voice firm. You're done here. She stood up, feeling a wave of disbelief wash over her. It didn't feel real. She had always been a dedicated employee, never late, always polite, always going the extra mile to make sure everything ran smoothly. And this was how it ended? Just like that? With no warning, no second chances? I'll get my things, Jasmine said quietly, her voice barely audible. She didn't know what else to say. The man who had been like a distant mentor to her was now treating her like a failure. She didn't want to argue anymore. What was the point? He had made up his mind, and nothing she could say would change that. As she walked toward the back room, her mind was racing. How would she explain this to Kenny, her 8-year-old son? She had always worked so hard to provide for him, to give him a better life than the one she had growing up. Now, she didn't know what she would do. The bills would pile up, the rent was due, and there was no safety net for her. Jasmine had no idea where she would go next. She grabbed her coat and purse from the small locker in the back, the weight of the reality settling over her. The last few years, she had poured her soul into this job, and now it was gone. Just like that. She could feel the sting of tears building in her throat, but she refused to cry. She wouldn't give Mr. Thompson the satisfaction of seeing her break down. As she stepped out the door of the diner for the last time, the bright daylight outside felt strangely harsh. She had always been a part of this town, a fixture in the diner, but now she felt like an outsider, cast adrift. The sound of the diner's bell jingling behind her seemed like an echo, a reminder that everything had changed in an instant. She couldn't believe it was over. She had tried to do the right thing, to stand up for what she believed in, but it had cost her everything. Jasmine stepped out into the cool afternoon air, the door of the Maple Leaf Diner swinging shut behind her with a finality that made her stomach churn. The sun, once warm on her face, now felt harsh, like the world had suddenly grown brighter and colder all at once. Her fingers gripped the strap of her purse, but she didn't really know where she was going. She wasn't thinking clearly, she was still reeling from the conversation with Mr. Thompson. Fired. It had all happened so fast, too fast for her to even process the consequences. She had stood up for what she believed was right, and now she was paying the price. She walked aimlessly down Main Street, her mind a jumble of thoughts. What was she going to do? How was she going to tell Kenny? Her son had always been her motivation, the reason she worked so hard to provide for him. He was the reason she had kept her head down, stayed focused, and done everything by the book. But now, all of that felt pointless. The job that had given her a sense of purpose and stability was gone, and she had nothing to fall back on. The bills were piling up, her rent was due in a week, and she couldn't afford to miss a paycheck. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through job listings, but nothing stood out. There were only a few low-paying jobs available in town, most were for retail or food service positions, jobs she had already worked and that didn't offer much more than what she'd had at the diner. It wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, about feeling like she mattered, like her work was valued. She had put her heart into everything she did, and now it felt like none of that mattered. Jasmine's mind kept returning to the incident at the diner. The confrontation with the two men, the way the argument had spiraled out of control, and how Baron Trump had been caught in the middle of it all. She hadn't planned for any of it, but when the man started yelling at Baron, something inside her snapped. She couldn't just stand by and let him be attacked. It wasn't about who Baron was, or what his family represented, it was about standing up for someone who couldn't defend themselves. But what had seemed like the right thing to do at the time had cost her everything. The more she thought about it, the more the anger began to rise. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? She had tried to protect someone, to prevent things from escalating. And yet, here she was, out of a job, with no safety net, and no one to turn to. She felt the familiar sting of injustice, that all too familiar feeling of being treated unfairly because of who she was. The color of her skin, her gender, these things had always played a role in how people saw her. But today, they felt like the only reasons she had been punished. She walked past the familiar storefronts, the ones she had passed every day on her way to work, but they felt alien now. Her town, the one she had always thought of as home, now felt like a place where she didn't belong. She was just another black woman in a small town where every move she made was scrutinized, judged, and often misunderstood. Maybe she had been naive to think that she could make a difference by standing up for someone who was different. Maybe she had underestimated the power of a divided community, a community that cared more about loyalty to political ideologies than basic human decency. Jasmine's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden vibration of her phone. She looked down at the screen and saw a message from her friend Carla, who worked at a local law office. Carla, hey, girl. Heard about what happened at the diner. You okay? Jasmine hesitated for a moment before typing a response. She didn't want to burden anyone with her problems, but she also couldn't deny the fact that she needed someone to talk to. Jasmine, not sure. Got fired. Long story, but I stood up for someone, and now I'm out of a job. She waited a moment before Carla replied. Carla, that's messed up. You don't deserve that. Let's talk soon. I know someone who might be able to help you. Call me later. Jasmine felt a small spark of hope. Carla had always been there for her, and the offer of help, however vague, was enough to push her to stop for a moment and breathe. She was grateful for the message, even though she wasn't sure how someone could help her at this point. But maybe there was something, some way to turn things around. As Jasmine continued walking, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an alert about a local news story. The headline caught her eye: Barron Trump spotted in small-town diner. What happened next will shock you. Her stomach turned as she clicked the link and read the article. It wasn't much, a brief mention of the incident, a few quotes from the two men who had been arguing, and a mention of her name. But the tone of the article was unmistakable. It painted her as the instigator, the one who had caused the confrontation by stepping in to defend Barron. There was no mention of why she had done it, no recognition of the fact that she had just been trying to protect someone. Instead, the article portrayed her as a troublemaker, someone who had created a scene in front of customers. The article was brief, but it was enough. Jasmine felt her blood run cold as she read the comments below the story. People were already speculating, already making assumptions about her based on a few lines in the local news. Some called her a hero, but most called her a liberal troublemaker, who had no business intervening in something that wasn't her fight. The judgment was swift, and it felt personal. The weight of the world was bearing down on her, and it was all because of a single decision she had made. She couldn't take it anymore. She turned off her phone and stuffed it back into her purse, her hands shaking. The article was the final straw, the moment when it all became too much to handle. It wasn't just about losing her job, it was about everything she had worked for being torn apart by a single decision. She had tried to do the right thing, and now it felt like the entire town was turning against her. Jasmine didn't know what to do next. She had no job, no support system, and now, no reputation. She felt isolated, like the walls were closing in. She couldn't go back to the diner, and she didn't know where to turn. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being able to handle whatever life threw her way. But this felt different. This felt like too much to bear. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, a small part of her refused to give up. It wasn't over. She wouldn't let it be over. She had to keep fighting, for herself and for her son. The world may have judged her, but she wasn't going to let that define her. She wasn't done yet. Jasmine's determination started to take root as the days passed. Despite the overwhelming weight of the situation, she found herself pushing through the fog of despair, unwilling to let this be the end of her story. She couldn't let her son, Kenny, see her broken. He had already faced enough struggles growing up, and she wasn't about to add to them by letting her defeat define her. Jasmine knew that there had to be something more, a way forward that could rebuild everything she had lost. The first few days after losing her job were a blur. She spent hours scrolling through job listings online, sending out resumes, and making calls to anyone who might know of an opening. But as she walked through the streets of her small town, it felt like every corner held a reminder of her fall from grace. She had always been a part of the community, a familiar face at the diner, always greeting the regulars with a smile. Now, she felt like an outsider, as though everyone had already judged her. Gossip was inevitable, and the local news story only made things worse. But in the midst of all the noise, a new opportunity began to take shape. It started when Carla, her friend from the law office, called to check in. Carla had been a constant source of support, and when she heard what had happened, she knew someone who could help. His name was Jason Michaels, an entrepreneur who had been making waves in the community by funding local initiatives aimed at helping people who had fallen on hard times. Jason wasn't just another rich businessman, he was someone who believed in second chances, and Carla had known him long enough to know that he wasn't the type to turn away someone in need. "Jasmine, I think you need to talk to Jason," Carla said when they met at a cafe. "He's been involved in community outreach for a long time, and I think he could help you get back on your feet. He's been looking for someone to help him run a new project, and you've got the skills. Don't let your pride get in the way of a chance to rebuild." Jasmine wasn't sure what to think at first. She had always been independent, never one to ask for favors or rely on anyone. But as Carla explained more about Jason's work, Jasmine couldn't deny the spark of hope that flickered inside her. This could be her chance to prove herself again, to do something meaningful for her community, something that wasn't just about surviving, but thriving. The next morning, Jasmine nervously dialed the number Carla had given her. Jason answered quickly, his voice warm and inviting. "Hello, Jasmine. Carla told me a little about you. I'm really sorry to hear what happened at the diner. I know things can get tough when the world seems to be working against you. But I want you to know that you're not alone in this. I've seen people bounce back from much worse, and I believe you can too." The sincerity in Jason's voice made Jasmine feel heard in a way she hadn't felt in days. He didn't judge her or see her as just another woman who had made a mistake. Instead, he saw potential, and that was enough to reignite the spark inside her. Over the next few weeks, Jasmine worked with Jason on his new project, an initiative designed to provide mentorship and job training to individuals who had faced setbacks in their careers, people like her who had made mistakes but were determined to move forward. The program was still in its early stages, but it was quickly gaining momentum. Jason had partnered with local businesses to provide internships and job placements for those involved, and the goal was to help them get back on their feet with dignity and confidence. Jasmine's role in the project was to assist with organizing the workshops, connecting people with mentors, and overseeing the progress of the participants. It was the first time in weeks that she felt like she had purpose again. Her work was important, and for the first time in a long time, she felt valued, not just as an employee, but as a person. As she became more involved with the program, Jasmine realized something she hadn't expected: her story, her experience, had value. She could use it to help others. It wasn't something she was ashamed of, but something that could inspire others to persevere, to stand up for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. At the same time, the community began to take notice of the changes Jasmine was making. Word got around that she was working with Jason on his new project, and people who had once judged her started to see her in a different light. The story of her firing had faded from the headlines, but the message of redemption and second chances was what stuck. People admired her resilience, and as she started to build connections with other community members, the isolation she had once felt began to dissipate. It wasn't easy. Jasmine faced resistance, not from everyone, but from those who still clung to their preconceived notions of who she was and what she had done. There were whispers at the local grocery store, glances exchanged at the post office, and a few customers who still didn't want to come to the project's events because of what had happened at the diner. But Jasmine refused to be discouraged. She didn't need their approval, she needed to stay true to herself, to the person she had always been deep down, someone who wanted to make a difference. One afternoon, as she was walking through the park after a meeting with one of the mentors, she ran into Mrs. Montgomery, a regular at the diner who had always been friendly, if a little reserved. Mrs. Montgomery had been one of the people who had commented on the incident with Baron Trump when it first made the news. But when she saw Jasmine standing in front of her, there was no judgment in her eyes. "You've been doing great work with that program, Jasmine," Mrs. Montgomery said, her voice kind. "I've heard a lot of good things. People around here, they've got a lot of opinions, but they're starting to realize you've got a heart for helping others. I just wanted you to know that." Jasmine felt a lump form in her throat. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. In that moment, she understood that her community, her town, was starting to see her differently, not as the woman who had caused a scene, but as the woman who had worked to make things right. The small victories like this one built up over time, and as she continued her work with the mentorship program, Jasmine started to feel a sense of belonging again. Slowly but surely, she was piecing together the parts of her life that had been shattered. The betrayal she had felt when she was fired was still there, but it no longer consumed her. She had learned to turn that pain into something productive, something that would allow her to give back. Months passed, and the program became a staple in the town. More and more people came to Jasmine for advice, for guidance, and many of them shared their own stories of struggle, just as she had shared hers. The walls she had once felt were closing in on her were now opening up, creating space for growth, change, and new beginnings. Jasmine's life was no longer defined by the events that had led to her firing, but by the way she had risen from it. And through it all, she had learned one thing: sometimes, the most unexpected moments can lead to the greatest transformations, not just in your own life, but in the lives of everyone around you. As Jasmine looked back on everything that had happened, the loss, the pain, the feeling of rejection, she realized that she wouldn't change a thing. It was the hard moments that had shaped her, and they were the ones that had prepared her for the future she was now building. She had stood up for what was right, and though it had cost her in the short term, it had given her a purpose that would last a lifetime. And with that, Jasmine knew one thing for certain: she wasn't done yet. The months that followed were a blur of hard work, personal growth, and steady transformation. Jasmine's life was beginning to feel like something she could control again, something that wasn't defined by the chaos that had originally torn it apart. As the mentorship program gained traction, more people from the community came forward, people who had faced their own challenges, their own setbacks, and began to find solace in Jasmine's example. The woman who had been fired for standing up to an injustice was now a symbol of resilience, a beacon for others who had been overlooked or underestimated. But even as Jasmine found purpose in helping others rebuild their lives, there was a constant ache in the back of her mind. It wasn't just the pain of losing her job, it was the lingering uncertainty of what lay ahead. She had done everything she could to prove herself, but there were still days when the whispers of judgment crept back into her thoughts. There were moments when she would be alone in her apartment, staring at her reflection in the window, wondering if the world would ever fully forgive her, if it would ever truly let go of the incident at the diner. Kenny, her son, had noticed the change in her. He had always been a quiet observer, wise beyond his years, and lately, he had been noticing that his mother's demeanor had shifted. She was still strong, still the woman who had always been there for him, but there was a quiet sadness that lingered in her eyes at times. Jasmine tried to mask it, but Kenny could see it in the way she held herself when she thought no one was watching. He was proud of his mom, so proud of how she had turned her life around, but he also wanted to make sure she knew she wasn't alone in this. One afternoon, as they sat together at their small kitchen table, Kenny said something that caught Jasmine off guard. "You've been working so hard, Mom," he said, his voice soft but steady. "But you don't have to do it alone. I see you. And I see what you've done for us, for everyone. I know it hasn't been easy, but you've made a difference." Jasmine swallowed hard, the lump in her throat growing. She had been so focused on making things right, on rebuilding her life, that she hadn't stopped to consider how her efforts had affected Kenny. He had always been her reason for pushing forward, but hearing him acknowledge her struggle made her realize how much he had been impacted by her journey. She had fought to build a better future for them, but in doing so, she had unknowingly built a bridge for them both to walk across, together. "I know, baby," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "But sometimes it feels like I'm not enough, you know? Like no matter how hard I try, I'm still fighting against something bigger than me." Kenny reached across the table and took her hand in his grip small but firm. "You're enough, Mom. You always have been. And you've shown me what it means to keep going, no matter what." In that moment, Jasmine realized something profound. She had been so focused on what she had lost that she hadn't truly seen all the ways in which she had gained. She had built a new foundation for her family, one that wasn't dependent on the whims of others. The mentorship program was growing, helping people like her find their way back to a place of purpose. The small victories, the ones that came in the form of a grateful participant or a thank you from a local business owner, were adding up. Her own journey, her resilience, was inspiring others to take their own steps toward redemption. And yet, despite all this progress, the shadow of what had happened at the diner continued to linger. The event had made her a polarizing figure in the community, and while there were those who had come to see her as a symbol of strength, there were still others who viewed her as nothing more than a troublemaker. The pain of being judged unfairly was something Jasmine knew she would never fully escape, but it was also a reminder of how far she had come. She had stood her ground when it mattered, and though the road ahead wasn't always smooth, she knew that her actions had shaped the way the world saw her now. One day, as the mentorship program's success continued to grow, Jasmine received an unexpected phone call. It was from a local news station that had covered the original story about the incident with Baron Trump. At first, she was hesitant, unsure of what to expect. But the reporter on the other end of the line explained that they had been following her progress and wanted to feature her in a segment about local heroes who were making a difference in the community. Jasmine was stunned. She had never expected to be recognized in such a public way, especially after everything that had happened. After a brief moment of hesitation, Jasmine agreed to the interview. She realized that this could be an opportunity to share her story, to let the world see who she truly was, not just the woman who had been fired, but the woman who had fought to make things right. It wasn't about seeking validation, it was about showing others that even in the face of adversity, it was possible to turn things around. The day of the interview, Jasmine stood in front of the camera, feeling a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. She had rehearsed her words in her head 1,000 times, but as the reporter asked her questions, the truth flowed from her without hesitation. She talked about the incident at the diner, about the unfairness of it all, and how she had made the decision to stand up for what was right, even when it cost her everything. She spoke about the mentorship program, about the people she had helped and the lives that had been changed as a result of the work she had done. As the segment aired later that week, Jasmine found herself watching it from her living room, her son by her side. She saw herself on the screen, the woman who had faced so much but had never given up. The community was seeing her in a new light, and for the first time in months, Jasmine allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found her place again. But the impact of that interview didn't stop there. The next few weeks brought a surprising turn of events. Jason's mentorship program received an outpouring of support from local businesses and individuals who wanted to contribute. The town, it seemed, had begun to heal, and the ripple effect of Jasmine's actions was being felt far and wide. Jasmine knew that the path to healing was never a straight line. There would always be moments of doubt, moments when the weight of the past would feel too heavy to bear. But she had learned something invaluable through this journey. She had the power to define her own story. Her decisions, her actions, her willingness to fight for what was right, these were the things that mattered. Not the judgments of others, not the setbacks or the obstacles, but the strength to rise again and again. As she looked at the small town around her, Jasmine realized that this was where her story had started. And now, it was where it would continue. She was no longer the woman who had lost everything in a single moment. She was the woman who had built something new, something lasting. And with every step forward, she was showing her son, her community, and herself that it was never too late to make a difference. She was just getting started. The winds of change were beginning to blow steadily through Jasmine's life. It wasn't immediate, nor was it without its challenges, but the longer she stayed focused on the bigger picture, the more she realized how much she had grown, and how much the community had shifted in response to her actions. The mentorship program was thriving, with new participants every month and more local businesses joining the initiative. Jasmine had found her place not just as a survivor, but as a leader, a beacon for others who, like her, had once been forgotten or overlooked. The pressure, however, was far from over. While Jasmine had made strides in her own healing process, there were still moments when doubt would creep in. The old feelings of inadequacy and fear of judgment haunted her in quiet, lonely hours. Despite the success of the mentorship program, Jasmine couldn't fully shake the feeling that she was still being defined by that moment at the diner. The way the news had twisted her actions to make her seem reckless, the way people had rushed to label her, it lingered, a shadow that never quite left her side. But she refused to let those feelings control her anymore. She had proven herself already, not just to the world, but to herself. Her days of running from her past were over. Jasmine had learned to walk through life with her head held high, embracing her journey, flaws and all. She realized that her past wasn't something she had to escape, it was something she had the power to redefine. Every challenge, every setback, every moment of rejection had shaped the person she had become today. It was in that crucible of hardship that she had forged the strength to continue, the resilience to keep fighting, and the wisdom to show others that the story didn't end with failure. One late evening, after a long day of overseeing a workshop, Jasmine sat in her office, reviewing the program's progress. Her phone buzzed with a new message, and as she glanced at it, her heart skipped a beat. It was from Carla. "Jasmine, I have someone who wants to meet you. You've become a legend around here. There's a potential investment coming through for the program, and they want you to lead it. I think this is it. You've earned it." The words seemed to blur for a moment. Jasmine had worked tirelessly for months, pouring her heart into the program, building something from the ground up. But this was different. This was more than just a recognition of her efforts. This could mean the financial stability that would ensure the program's future, the resources to expand and help even more people in need. It could be the lifeline she had been waiting for. Her mind raced as she read the message again. The reality of it all sank in slowly. This was the moment she had been waiting for, but it also felt like a test. She had been given the opportunity to move beyond where she had been before, to go beyond surviving and into something much bigger. It was no longer just about her, it was about the legacy she wanted to leave for the people she had helped. The people who had looked up to her not just for what she had done, but for who she had become. The next morning, Jasmine met with the investors. She had prepared for the meeting by going over every detail of the program, its successes, its challenges, and its future goals. But as she sat across from the men and women who had the power to shape her program's future, she realized that this was her moment to show them what she had learned, to demonstrate not just the potential of the program, but the impact it could have on the community. She spoke passionately about the work they had done so far, the lives that had been changed, the success stories that had emerged, the ripple effect that was slowly transforming the town. She explained how the program was more than just a job training initiative. It was a movement, a reminder that even people who had made mistakes, people who had fallen from grace, deserved a second chance. Jasmine wasn't asking for handouts, she was offering them a chance to invest in something that could truly make a difference in the world. For an hour, she spoke with conviction, detailing everything the program had accomplished and everything it still hoped to achieve. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't desperate. She was confident, because she knew, deep down, that she was worthy of this chance. When she finished, there was a silence in the room, a wait to the moment that felt like it stretched on for eternity. Finally, one of the investors spoke up. "Jasmine, your passion is undeniable. Your story is powerful. We've heard a lot of pitches over the years, but none quite like yours. We believe in what you're doing here. We want to help you take this to the next level." Jasmine's heart soared. It wasn't just the money, though that would secure the future of the program, it was the validation. The moment she had longed for. The world was finally seeing her not as the woman who had been fired, but as the woman who had turned her life around, who had made something of herself. More importantly, she was being recognized for her commitment to helping others do the same. Over the next few weeks, the mentorship program flourished. The new investment allowed them to hire more staff, offer more services, and expand their reach into neighboring towns. The program was becoming a model for similar initiatives around the region, and Jasmine had become a sought-after speaker, invited to conferences and panels to share her story of resilience and redemption. But the true reward came when Jasmine started to see the faces of the people whose lives had been transformed. There were the single mothers who had regained their independence, the men who had struggled with addiction and found new purpose, the young people who had dropped out of school and now had careers ahead of them. Each one was a testament to the power of second chances, to the idea that no one's story had to end with their mistakes. Jasmine knew that the work was far from over. There were still people who needed help, still obstacles to overcome. But the difference now was that she no longer felt alone in this fight. The community had come together in a way that she never thought possible, and through her leadership, they had created a movement that was bigger than any one person. As the months went by, Jasmine's sense of fulfillment grew, but so did her resolve. She had proven herself to be more than just a survivor. She had become a creator, someone who could build, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed it. The journey had not been easy, and there were times when it seemed like the odds were insurmountable. But in the end, Jasmine had learned one undeniable truth: the hardest battles were often the ones that brought about the greatest change. And through her perseverance, she had sparked a change not just in her own life, but in the lives of many others. Looking out over the town, as the sun set on another day, Jasmine felt a sense of peace she had never known before. The future was uncertain, yes, but she was ready for whatever it held. Because, for the first time in her life, Jasmine knew who she was, not defined by the mistakes of the past, but by the choices she made each day to be better, to do better, and to help others rise alongside her. The story she had started years ago was no longer about defeat. It was about triumph. And this was just the beginning.